So this video is going to be all about the English as a First Language Paper 2 Question 2, which is the language analysis question. Now remember, on your Paper 2 you are going to have 3 questions. Question 1 is worth 20 marks. Question 3 is also worth 20 marks. And then question 2, which is worth 10 marks. You can see then that you shouldn't spend as much time on question 2 as you should exercise 1 and 2. This is a common mistake. Sometimes people feel like they should write the exact same amount, and that's just not true. You should only be writing a maximum of 2 pages for question 2, depending on the size of your handwriting, of course. You just need to say your 4 images for each of the 2 paragraphs and then get out of there. You're not trying to write a really long, detailed literature style essay. You are just analysing those images and moving on, getting on to the next questions. So firstly, a reminder then of overall exam technique for your exercise 2. Reminder that for each of the 2 paragraphs you should write an overall effect sentence. So that sentence will say very simply, the overall effect of this paragraph is. Just quickly tell the examiner what that overall effect is to show that you've understood and comprehended that paragraph. Also, as you'll see later on in the mark scheme, the examiner is given a general overall effect. So if you can identify that to begin with, you're getting off to a very good start on your question. And then after you've done your overall effect paragraph, you should follow that up with your 4 supporting images. And reminder that you must have 4 supporting images for each paragraph. So that's a total of 8 images overall. A reminder to use some short quotations, no more than 4 to 5 words. If you're doing more than 5 words, it's probably not an image. You're writing out too many words. Make sure you're picking images, so don't just pick out single words that you think are going to be easy to write about. When you're reading that paragraph, really try to see in your mind's eye the images that those words are creating for you, and if there are particularly strong images that stand out to you the first time you read it, those are probably the things that you should write about in your exercise 2. Some of the things that you can talk about: analyse your connotations, what those words make you think of, what is the effect on the reader, why has the writer chosen that word. That why is what's going to get you a high mark if you can answer that properly. And also another thing to look out for is any contrast. Now, not every single exam will give you the ability to analyse some contrast, but lots of them do give you some contrast, perhaps between rich and poor, between kind and evil. That's usually something that's quite easy to find and quite easy to speak about, but don't panic if you can't find it. And a reminder, as we will see later on, that the highest marks are awarded for originality. So don't just say the most obvious thing, the first thing that comes to your head. Try to stop and think about each of the image just for 5-10 seconds. What else could you say about it? Usually the first thing that comes to your head, that's what's going to get you a C, and the thing that comes to your head after a little bit of thinking is the more original thought that's going to get you the higher grade. So a quick sketch then of what your exam paper should look like for exercise 2. So here's your page. So I said probably about 2 pages you'll end up writing. So I'm going to write A and B. I'm going to make it really obvious to the examiner when I start talking about the other paragraph. I'm going to begin each of them with an overall effect sentence. Incorrect spelling there, ignore me. Overall effect. And then I'm going to find my 4 images. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is it. So the reason why I say it's really important for you to have your overall effect sentence is because you're on limited time. You can't keep on saying that effect over and over again and repeating yourself for all of these 4 images, because you're going to be wasting time. You're going to start to think, God, what I'm writing sounds really, really stupid, because you're just repeating yourself over and over again. Actually, you can say the overall effect is this, and here are my 4 pieces of evidence to support that. These are some of the connotations. This is why the writer's done this. There we go, next paragraph. So you don't need to constantly repeat the effect, just say that in your overall effect sentence. And obviously you're going to do this twice, so you're going to have 2 overall effect sentences because you've got 2 different paragraphs to analyse, and you're going to have your 4 other images. So that is 8 images in total. I would recommend perhaps numbering them or underlining them, just so that you know that you've definitely spoken about 8 different images, 4 for each paragraph. You don't want to get to the end and realise that you haven't actually answered the question properly because you've not spoken about 8 images. So before we do this bit, I recommend that you pause the video and go and read the extract that I've sent you guys. But right now I'm just going to read out the 2 paragraphs that we're going to be analysing. So here's the first paragraph. All courage left him when the ship was gone. The sea stretched out endlessly. The thinly penciled line of the horizon was, he knew, the only limit of his sight. The sea that had once beckoned freedom and fortune now locked him in. He stayed by the shore, scanning the ocean. Whatever their fate, he now wanted to be with them. Without them, the island was a prison, and he was a mariner without a ship, or a man without a voice. The day grew cool, the wind ruffled the water, and for a moment a rogue wave or cloud looked like a billowing sail. He could not leave the shore. He clambered over the stones to the western edge of the bay, wanting a wider view of the ocean, but he was trapped in the bay by the sheer cliffs. Our second paragraph now. The sun dipped down, the air cooled, the mountain darkened, and the moon cut a path across the ocean. All night the seals howled. They were the monsters of the deep. He fired a bullet into the air. For a minute, the bay seemed quiet. Then it started again. A croak, a howl. This island was a place of terror. There was fear in the dancing shadows of night. A hostile presence sensed his every move. The wind surged through the valley. The wind, he was to learn, was the strongest when the moon was full. It uprooted trees. They swished and crashed. The sound merged with the breaking waves and the calling seals. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is what I recommend that you do in your exam, which is I'm going to look over it and I'm going to underline some of the potential images that I could speak about. So you know that you need to find a minimum of 4 to talk about, but I would recommend that perhaps you aim to find around 6, and that way you've got a lot of choice when you come to write. If you think, I feel like I'm repeating the same thing over and over again, maybe I'll talk about image number 6 instead. Don't have to, but I just think it's a good suggestion. So firstly, I'm just going to go through and I'm going to underline what I think are some images. I think the sea stretching endlessly is for sure an image. Also the fact that it's not saying the sea stretched on endlessly, but saying out. Usually we use the phrase stretch out for animals or people. Animals and people stretch out. Usually they stretch out and yawn. So perhaps that's a little bit of an example of personification, which makes the sea seem like it's alive, like it's full of life, like it's immensely big. which is also emphasized by the word endlessly. It's like the sea goes on and on and on, and it doesn't end. The sea is the whole world. Next image then, let's take a look. The sea that had once beckoned freedom. Again, I think that that's an example of personification, saying the sea had once almost waved freedom. If you beckon someone, you're welcoming them or waving them or calling them. So again, I think that's an example of personification. But it's also saying that the sea represents freedom to him, that it means everything to him. I guess possibilities, hope, and fortune now locked him in. I think that locked him in for me is for sure an image. When I hear that phrase, I imagine someone obviously in prison, vulnerable, powerless. And really that's like a really big contrast to this sea stretched out endlessly, whereas up here you're stretching out endlessly. You've got so much space and so much freedom to do whatever you want, compared with being locked in a confined space. So you've got like a big space versus a small space, freedom versus what's the opposite of freedom? My mind's gone completely blank. Being in jail, it'll come to me later on. Let's carry on looking for some more images. And then see here, without them the island was a prison. Once again we've got this imagery being repeated of being in prison, of being trapped. That's interesting. So these two images would fit quite well with each other, or perhaps if you didn't want to repeat yourself too much, you could just talk about them together. He was a mariner without a ship, a man without a voice. I think you could speak about either of these two separately. I probably wouldn't do both of them. Perhaps let's do man without a voice. If you're without a voice again, you are completely powerless, you're completely vulnerable, but it perhaps also shows that frustration, a lack of control. If you're without a voice, it makes me think that there's lots that you want to say, shout, scream, and you can't, which makes me think, yeah, of that frustration. Next, how about a rogue wave? Usually we use that word rogue to describe a person who is a little bit troublesome, a little bit naughty. So again, that's perhaps personifying the sea, personifying that wave as carefree, dangerous, out of control, but in a good way, like anything could happen. Oh, the clouds look like a billowing sail. He's looking up at the clouds and he's seeing a billowing sail. Again, I suppose to him that would represent that freedom, because of course the sail is what's on the boat. But also that word billowing, we use that to describe usually a piece of fabric that's got a lot of air underneath it, that's blowing in the wind, full of air. So that makes me think of something that's light, free, easily moved, like he wants to be. And the sail might make me think of possibilities. And now we're back to some more contrast down here. He was trapped in the bay by the sheer cliffs. That is an image too. So I'm imagining this man say, here. So you'll have to pardon me because I accidentally clicked onto the next slide, which I didn't realise means that I now can't go back and continue my point without deleting everything that I said and doing it all over again. So the point that I was trying to make in general anyway is there is that contrast again of what he wants. He wants to be free, he wants this freedom, versus the reality of being trapped, being imprisoned. So what I want you guys to do now is to do what I've just done with your second paragraph. So stop and pause this video, and I want you to highlight key images and start to think, what do they represent? What are their connotations? So pause this video now and do that for this paragraph, please. So nextly, we're going to talk about the Marc scheme. So I wrote my ideas before I looked at the Marc scheme on purpose to kind of show you what perhaps naturally would stand out to me or what might stand out to you versus what might stand out to the examiners and what we're trying to look for. So for the first paragraph, the overall effect, the general effect is one of isolation and fear. Selkirk feels trapped and imprisoned by the sea and cannot escape. For sure, I think we got this meaning of him feeling trapped and imprisoned. I thought that was very, very clear. So this is your overall effect, and then the Marc scheme is now going to give some suggestions of things that we could have spoken about. So these are the suggestions from the exam board. You don't necessarily have to have exactly this. You don't necessarily need to say these exact same points. The Marc scheme does specifically say that the examiners can give you credit for any analysis that you give that is evidenced by the text. So basically, as long as your analysis makes sense and it's backed up by the text, you could argue for that interpretation very sensibly, then you'll be able to get a good mark for it. So the first image then is stretched out endlessly, talking about how the sea is flat and huge, infinite, it lasts forever, and that emphasizes his isolation. The fact that because the sea is so big, that shows how powerless he is in comparison. The thinly penciled line of the horizon. So imagining that horizon line is just like, have I got the colour grey? I can't. It's just like this very thin, faint line like this. So that says the exam board that the horizon is flat. I would say that's a very, very obvious point for the exam board to make. That the horizon appears indistinct, sketchy, only faintly visible. There's nothing between him and the horizon, nothing beyond it. No sign of civilization or hope. That's a slightly more intelligent point from CIE at the end. The fact that this horizon stretches on for as far as he can see until it's just this thin line shows that there's absolutely nothing out there to give him help or give him hope. Next, we have got something that once beckoned freedom and fortune, the image of freedom and fortune. Here, the sea is usually used to show opportunity and riches, as if it's calling him for an adventure or for a better life, and that shows a slightly romanticized view of the sea. It's quite a romantic image. That he's locked in. The fact that he cannot escape, he's trapped and imprisoned by the sea has become his jailer. So again there you could argue that's personification. The image of the prison too, which we touched on ourselves. The fact that the island limits his freedom, it's like he's in solitary confinement, he's isolated all by himself. Man without a voice, he's unable to speak or express himself, no one can hear him, emphasizes his helplessness, the fact that he can't do anything to help himself. like a piece of him is missing, like a part of his body is missing almost. Like a billowing sail. The fact that the wind is in the ship's sails represents the hope of rescue, reminds him of the fact that he will need a ship to escape and how exhilarating, how exciting sailing is. And then finally, trapped in the bay, caught, cornered, can go no further. The surrounding cliffs seem like a cage to him. So this is what the exam board thinks that you should say. Now we're going to have a look at the mark scheme for the second part, the second paragraph. I'm not going to read it all out loud because I think that you can do that. But let's see if when you did this bit by yourself, you got these points. So the overall effect is one of nightmare and terror. The island and its inhabitants, the people or animals that live there, seem hostile, dangerous, unfriendly, and threatening. Here are some of the images. You should pause this video now to read it and see if you found these images yourself when you did your practice. Please pause the video now. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about some common mistakes that my class often makes, for sure, and how you can avoid them. The first thing is not explicitly making your point clear. Perhaps you're not really finishing off your sentence, or sometimes I find that students don't give precise enough words. They don't give an accurate adjective to really explain the point that they're trying to make. So here are some examples of this. The writer uses the phrase "press white shirt" to show what the waiter is like. Slick back shows what the waiter's hair looks like. Wizened shows what the boy's life is like. Deflated membrane shows the appearance of the boy. Here you can see that you're not really explaining anything. Like, obviously any sort of description of appearance is used to show what someone looks like, but what you're trying to do here is explain what that image is, and so you need to give an adjective. So in the first one, to show what the press white shirt shows what the waiter looks like, what you're trying to say is to show that the waiter is clean, tidy, and well-mannered. Slicked back shows what the waiter's hair looks like. Perhaps we should say instead to show that the waiter's hair is greasy and looks similar to stereotypes of gangsters. Wizened shows what the boy's life is like. Shows that the boy's life is hopeless. Deflated membrane shows the appearance of the boy as being sickly, on the verge of death. So if you ever say a phrase and it's got what blah 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 looks like or what blah 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 behaves like, then you know that you've not really explained your point. You need to have your adjectives, you need to explain your point fully, explicitly, make yourself really, really clear. Don't assume that the examiner knows what point you're trying to make. You need to say your point. Next is not picking images. So sometimes people just pick out one or two interesting words. Perhaps they are interesting, but it's not really an image and there's not really a lot that you can say about it. So remember that an image is often a metaphor in disguise. Often it compares something to something else. For example, the waiter to a ringmaster, the restaurant to a circus, a starving boy to a corpse, beach cliffs to a prison. It's a metaphor in disguise. In other words, you should be looking for words that represent something as being something else. That might be a verb that has got the action associated with humans. it might be a proper noun, a place name that perhaps you would associate with a particular location. So, for example, if you're talking about the circus and you're using the circus to describe a classroom, you're looking for something that represents something else. That is usually your image. Another thing that you could do to help you to find images is, as you're reading it, you could scribble quick little pictures that come to your head. So if I was going to do this, like next to corpse, here's a skull. And the things that you find it the easiest to draw images for probably are images. Maybe perhaps you don't have time to actually do that, but in your head you could be imagining what you could draw for that. And that might give you a hint as to what is an image. Another common mistake is repeating yourself over and over and over and over again. An example, the boy is shown as being weak and poor. The word carcass has connotations of poor, which shows us how weak he is. Another phrase that shows us how weak the boy is blah, 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 blah. This can easily be avoided if you just say the overall effect in your introductory sentence and then give 4 different ways that the text creates this overall effect. Quite often people start repeating themselves when they're trying to say the overall effect over and over and over again. You really don't need to do that. Just say it at the start and move on. Going off topic. So this was for a past paper that we did. If you're being asked about the waiter's appearance and behaviour and about the boy, then you should only answer on those particular things. So read the exam question really carefully. Don't start talking about something that you're not being asked about. Don't go off topic unless it's very, very brief and mentioned in relation to the question. And don't spend any longer than 1 sentence on this, and make sure your point is clearly linked back to the question. But generally, if you're talking about something that's not mentioned in the question, you can pretty much assume that you're not going to get any marks for doing it. This common mistake I see a lot, which is going straight into analysing the connotations without first explaining the overall effect. So your very, very first sentence should be that overall effect, and then you do your connotations. Don't just begin with connotations, because otherwise it's not clear that you've really understood the passage. So this here is not a very good example. Wizened has connotations of death, black, unhealthy, so the boy is unhealthy and probably not happy. Change that to the overall effect of the boy is to show that he is unhealthy, unhappy, and create sympathy for the reader. For example, wizened has connotations of blah, blah, blah. So next I'm going to talk about the Marc scheme and about how you can achieve that top band and some common mistakes that stop people from achieving the top band. So firstly, you need to make sure that you are answering both parts of the question equally well. So if your part A is a lot better than your part B, you're going to find it difficult to get into that top band. The next is you need to say why the writer creates these images. How did the writer want you to feel, and why did they want you to feel that way? If you just identify the images and their connotations but don't really say what the point of them was, why the writer wanted that image to come into their reader's head, then you're not going to be able to get 9 out of 10. Next is this imagery. If you're not really focusing on imagery and you're focusing more on individual words and connotations, then you're not going to get a very good mark. You need to say, what is the overall effect, or does it contrast to something else? This is one of the biggest differences, is that your analysis will show some imagination. If you analyse clearly, but most of the things that you say are kind of obvious, most people could think of that, then it's not really very imaginative. If your connotations and your analysis make sense, but it's obvious, not creative, you're not going to be able to get more than 8. So you should be trying to think beyond the first thing that comes to your head, trying to be a little bit more creative with your analysis. And finally, I need to see clear evidence that you understand how language works. If some sections of your writing don't really show that you understand the text, you really misread parts of it, maybe you show that you haven't even understood the basic plot, it's going to be hard for me to say that there's clear evidence that you understand how language works. Some advice there is, if you don't know what a word means, then don't write about it. Write about a different word. So that's why I say try to pick around 6 images at least in your first planning stages, and then think about which ones can I write about the best. Are there any words in image 5 that I'm not clear on? If that's the case, you shouldn't talk about that image. So that is everything now then. I think that it would be a really good idea for you to practice writing up your answer for this particular question paper. But then after you've finished doing that, you should go and find a different question paper that you've never practiced before. Have a go at doing that without looking at the mark scheme, and then compare what you wrote to the mark scheme to see how close you were. My final reminders then, that you should always begin with an overall effect sentence. Each paragraph should have 4 images picked out, and you should say why the writer wanted you to feel however he or she made you feel, why the writer created these images. Very good luck, and if you've got any questions then please do let me know.